thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Hi, Neil. Thanks for having me.
I'm quite excited to have you here today. Your story and what you've been doing in the HMO space is very unique. And a good friend of mine told me about you and what you'd been doing, and I didn't quite believe that it was either true or possible. And you've since sent over a case study to us, which I've been looking at, and I've found it really, really interesting. So I'm very excited about having this conversation today. Now, there may be some of our listeners out there who haven't come across you yet, Samuel. So just for the benefit of anyone who isn't aware of you and what you're doing, give us an idea of where you are, what you're doing, and what your goals and objectives are in the HMO space.
Sure. So we live in Amsterdam, and we is my wife and my 3-year-old son. So I work in startups now, been in operations for over 10 years. Before we moved here, I was working for Amazon and then was approached by a startup to come and help launch operations across Europe. So we moved over to Amsterdam. Investment-wise, we kind of started back in 2008 with our first, actually when I was a student, so 23 years old, I saved up my student loan and didn't work at the same time to buy my first property. And through the pandemic, we kind of had a bit of a reassess in terms of our goals, where we wanted to be, and ultimately we want to be kind of time rich now that we've got a family. And that kind of led us to I think what we're going to touch on today, which was our latest project and how that kind of all happened.
It sounds like you've had some very exciting and I assume roles with a huge amount of responsibility, and that's still the case, isn't it? You know, I think you're a COO of a very big company, so yeah. I can only imagine it's very busy, quite demanding, and I'm sure quite exciting. So, I mean, for me, there's always the question, and I think I've probably been scarred over the years from doing so many HMOs and managing so many tenants, but why, particularly HMOs? Why not other investment strategies?
Sure. Well, so I think for me, because I work in this space that is starting and scaling businesses, I'm used to kind of daily challenges. So HMOs are, let's say, harder than vanilla single lets, but if you do them right, they really give you that cash flow. But also, what's really important to us is the return on capital. So we want to recycle as much money as possible and ultimately go quicker, so that I can kind of be in a position where maybe I'm not working 7 days a week trying to scale businesses across Europe and the US. And so HMOs really can deliver that monthly cash flow, recycle our money, and really kind of create the cookie cutter strategy that we want to align to our goals.
And I think in your case study, if I remember rightly, I think what you said was one of the companies that you had worked for was actually the fastest growing company in Europe. I think it achieved sort of unicorn, $1 billion status faster than any company has done in Europe before. Is that right?
Yeah, in history. Yeah, so worldwide, I think it was 14 months from zero to unicorn. So yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. And today, the deal that we're going to talk about, and we're going to work around this fantastic deal that you've done, but this in itself is a bit of a unicorn deal. So you seem like a good man to know, Samuel. I think you might be someone I want to spend a lot more time around. But I'm looking forward to getting into all of this. So we're going to talk about this project. You've shared the numbers, and I don't want to give too much away just yet. But what I'm particularly interested in is how you have made all of this work in the way that you have. So let's just kind of rewind a little bit. You guys are in Amsterdam now. You've got a very busy, demanding job. You've got a 3-year-old, so you've got all that happening at home as well. And you've decided to embark on this idea of building the HMO portfolio. So can you talk to us, Samuel, about how you actually decided on what and where? Talk us through this process that you've been through, because I've got this information from the case study, and I know from talking to you, we've already discussed this, and it's fascinating. And I think one of the things that really stood out for me is the amount of work and diligence you obviously gave to this exercise. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people out there still do rush into buying something or investing in a particular location. And for you, obviously, you had less of those sort of luxuries that many of us have, being able to jump in the car and drive up the motorway. That's quite different for you. So can you talk us through this process that you went through of deciding what and where you were actually going to build this business?
Yeah. So we're obviously, because we're in Amsterdam, we're not tied to a single location. We're not sure if we'll return to the UK, and if we do, we're not sure where. So that kind of really gave us freedom almost, and too much choice of where to do this next project. So that was where I really kind of spent 6 months basically building a model, manually, because there isn't something you can download. We all get different reports from, was it Home Track or Rightmove, etc. But it never really quite, gives you the information that you need. And so I'm all about, in my day job, removing risk and ultimately removing friction as well, so we can go as quickly as possible. So that does take time to then build that due diligence into the process. So took 130 markets, basically every student market in the country, whether it was a town or a city, because students were aligned to our goals, and took those 130 with our fixed kind of investment criteria, looking at population of the market, investment in the market, transport links, average house prices currently, the last year's, so year-on-year growth, and recovery since 2007, to really build an objective number to say, right, okay, well, which is the market that's best aligned to our goals. So taking 130 down to 20, 10, and finally a kind of final 6, and using a kind of payback period as the kind of guiding principle, but then also factoring things like, is Article 4 in the market? Yes or no? Is that Article 4 actually affecting the student stock? Yes or no? To then ultimately say, okay, well, which is our best market? And obviously the Liverpools, the Manchesters, the Leeds come out on top, but there were elements there where we were probably a year and a half behind the curve, and so then that kind of price point to buy in is just that much higher, and so that led us to our investment market.
So it sounds like you almost built this matrix where you had all these criteria, and you could score each of these locations against those items. Mm-hmm. And then did you basically just look at which had sort of consistently scored the best in those categories, and I suppose took a view on what your priorities were? So you mentioned then that in some cities you felt that you were probably a few years behind the curve, and I assume you're talking about because prices are a bit higher, that market's a bit more established, the yields are a bit lower, a bit less opportunity. So is that what you did? You basically put all of this into a matrix, and once that data was in there, you could really see, actually, this one or this location is going to be the best bet for us.
Yeah, exactly that. Because if you look at, let's say, average rents for a double bed, they don't actually drastically change across the country once you're outside of London. Whereas a 3-bed house is massively different, whether you're investing in Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, or further south. So that's where actually, if you're looking at the returns and the yields versus your buy-in, that's obviously more attractive. But we did also want to look at capital growth as well, because this is a long play. We're doing this for the future, and so that recovery since 2007 was also really important for us, because if a market was at, say, 30% versus another one at 6 or 8%, then it kind of gave us the indication that maybe with that ripple effect, you haven't missed all of that growth. So you're just reducing risk in the future.
I noticed you talked about some of this stuff in detail in the case study, and I found it really, really interesting. And specifically on the capital appreciation point, it was interesting to see that you'd really considered that. And I've said it on the podcast a few times, actually. I did an analysis. I think I actually did an episode on the very first HMO I bought, and I've done it on other HMOs since. And I looked at, actually, where the performance has really come from. Has it come from the cash flow over the last 10, 12, 15 years? Has it come from the capital appreciation, which has been more or less? And actually, I was quite surprised to see that it has been consistently, in almost every single case, the capital appreciation that has still outperformed the cash flow. The great thing is they've done both, and in my opinion, to a great level, far outperforming what something like a vanilla buy-to-let would do. But I do think it's still so important to factor in what the future might look like and hold in terms of those values. And actually, when you get beyond that 3 to 5 year period, where you're trying to use every sort of penny you've got to reinvest and beg, borrow and steal, actually, when you get beyond that 5 year point, in the right market, actually, As things start to go up in value, then you can tap into that equity and refinance and pull it out. And that is actually how most people have built really successful portfolios. It's got to a point where actually that growth has kind of come from within the portfolio itself. So it was interesting to see that. And yeah, I think you've explained it really well in the case study. I want to go back to something you said, which was the time that this took, or the time that you invested in this project. And I think you said 6 months, didn't you, Samuel?
Yeah, so that model, like, it was manual. So this was me, going to each of these markets, particularly the top 20, and really having a deep dive on each market, looking at every property within a mile of a university, and looking at every property that was on the market, listing those prices, the selling prices, the room rates. So you can imagine how much kind of back and forth between Rightmove and my spreadsheet.
Wow. So I think it just really highlights the importance of doing this sort of due diligence. Mm-hmm. And I think I was about to find out with your case study and how you've managed to do it from several thousand miles away, how valuable this exercise can be. But it just does require a bit of elbow grease and a certain amount of time and patience, because, like you said, it is a very manual exercise. So, well, tell us where you settled on in the end then.
Yeah, so Huddersfield was number one, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of eyebrows raised and question marks, because it's not, I guess, the most exciting or the sexiest market that everybody's talking about. You don't often hear about it in the kind of top markets to look at, but for us, it ticked every box, nestled nicely between Manchester and Leeds. And I think really that ripple effect on the capital appreciation, university size, investment, and then, price point to buy in, and ultimately what the payback period would be. And it's probably good to mention at this point that we'd never been to Huddersfield at this point. And then that, I guess, makes this project even more interesting in the fact that we then decided to invest in this market, having never been there and planning to never see the property until it was actually, whichever property we chose, until it was actually fully renovated. So kind of proof of concept.
Have you since been to Huddersfield? Have you been yet?
I have, yeah. So the first time I went to Huddersfield was literally the day before tenants were moving in, and I was just there to kind of see some photography and videos being taken before our tenants moved in. So we did fully test that from zero, building a team on the ground to ultimately tenants going in.
I suspect at this point our listeners are probably thinking, oh, sure, Samuel probably bought something that didn't need much work and, was just ready to move tenants in, maybe a lick of paint, a home's under the hammer job. Mm. But let me just stop everybody in their tracks, because what you actually spent was £175,000 on this refurb. So this was by no means a small job. So let's go back a step again, before you've actually seen this property. How did you even go about viewing and doing the sort of on the ground due diligence that we would normally, and I would certainly always try and encourage anyone to do? How did you manage all of that?
Yeah, this was obviously, it was our kind of biggest investment to date in terms of the size of the property, but also the capital that we put in. So I was obviously very conscious that becoming new parents as well, like this is kind of all on my analysis. So we had to start really with, okay, I've got to build a team on the ground. They've got to be people that I've got to kind of get to know them and trust them without being face to face with them. Viewings was obviously one of the hardest things. There are companies out there that offer this kind of third-party viewing service, either dropping off keys or doing video walkthroughs, etc. But it wasn't really to the level that I needed. So it took a while to kind of find somebody to work with directly, to really kind of set what's our kind of standard operating procedure, like SOP, for doing a viewing. What's that level of quality that we require, and ultimately what's the output of that viewing that we can assess that viewing versus 3 or 4 or 5 others, to then be able to say, okay, well this is the one we're going to go with, and we're actually going to put our money where our mouth is and offer, without having seen it ourselves, looked at the cracks, not tapped on the walls, and felt, okay, this one feels okay, or we can't smell the damp, all of those elements.
So, did you find the builder, the people, before then you actually found the property? Is that what you went out and did?
No, we found somebody to, well, we tried various people to do the viewings. Once we found one that we were, a lady that we were happy with, we worked with her. She got us a kind of shortlist together to the standard that we want. Once we'd then offered and had an offer accepted on the property that we ended up buying, then it was kind of like, right, okay, now we're going through conveyancing. We need to find an architect, a builder, structural engineer, etc.
So you started to build a power team. And this lady that you found then to help you do the viewings, how did you find that lady?
So initially it was through a contact. So basically all of our kind of contacts came from that kind of initial contact. So speaking to agents, you then get a couple of recommendations, you speak to a few people, they then recommend other people. And so there was kind of this, train of recommendations of people through people. But ultimately you do kind of have to get to a point where you just have to trust that, okay, somebody's gonna do what they do, and then you can just verify their work. So we did work with, I think, 4 or 5 people that ultimately just didn't deliver really what we were looking for, and then finally we've met the lady that ultimately now we still work with today.
I think another good example of going through the process, doing your due diligence, kissing a few frogs, which is often the way it is in property. And I think it's really difficult to get all of your ducks in a row. And I think a lot of us would like to be able to do that. But the reality is sometimes you've just got to get stuck in to a market, start to open a few doors and then wedge them open. And actually behind that door, you often find a number of people, like you said, like you found, that can help you take your business to that next level. They know somebody. I guess it's that kind of activity starts to generate results. And it's a very interesting way of looking at this. And I guess really highlighted by the fact that you didn't have a choice. You weren't there on the ground to do it yourself. You've had to figure all of this stuff out. I mean, was there a point at which you ever questioned or doubted or were concerned about what you were doing or might be about to do and embark on? I know that even to this day, when I complete on something, there's a moment, and it doesn't often last too long, but there's a moment when I buy the property and I step in and I sort of think, oh shit, what have I bought? what have I done? And then the logic kicks back in and I go through the motions. Yeah, okay, this is what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do. Was there any of that with you, Samuel? Like, was there a point at which you were concerned at all?
Yeah, many. Yeah, I think it was doing this through the pandemic was it was a challenging time for everybody. So I think, and then, like I said, becoming new parents, it then just adds that kind of level of, I'm not a student anymore, or I haven't just graduated. It's just me to worry about. Now we do own properties. We've got a young family, and so that responsibility level kind of grows over time. So yeah, there were the countless times where I guess you kind of wish maybe I could just jump in the car and go and figure this out, but then you just have to work a bit harder to ultimately get over every challenge, because I've managed teams on the west coast of the US, and due to the time difference, there's no way that I can even get together with them sometimes once a quarter. So you just have to learn how to figure these things out, and every challenge is surmountable, and the answer might just be don't do anything for now and sleep on it. But yeah, many challenges that we went through.
Do you think that there's a point at which you just have to acknowledge that there is a degree of risk and you've just got to take that leap of faith, believe in the research you've done, back yourself?
Yeah, 100%. I think if you're not willing to make a risk, probably HMOs is not the business for you. I think in general, running any business, you're not going to be an entrepreneur if you can't take stomach risk, because there ultimately is risk. Even with my 6 months in a building a model, you still have to then ultimately put action and execution into action. So
I completely agree. And I did a talk last year, and it was about some of the characteristics that I've seen, common characteristics I'd seen in some of the most successful examples of people who've grown very good and very profitable portfolios. And one of the things that I said in that was that you've got to have an appetite for risk. There's a lot of logic that can be applied to pretty much everything, and there's a lot of mitigation of risk that we can do. But there's still a point at which you can't remove all of the risk, and you don't have all of the answers. And I think a good example is something like, well, you don't quite know what's behind the walls until until you get into it, and you don't really know what the valuation's going to be until the guy or girl turns up and values it, and who knows what the weather will be like that day or what side of the bed they get out of, and I think all of those variables that we can't control, they're the bits that I think people find really concerning. And I often found myself telling people, look, I think you've done everything that you possibly can. This now is about whether or not you sort of back yourself on the work that you've done, but there is a leap of faith and you kind of just need to take that. I think the good thing about property is, though, it's a very forgiving asset class. If you get the fundamentals right, location, your tenant demographic, sort of the end product, I think there's usually scope to figure the rest out. If you're sensible and smart, if you overspend on your refurb or your valuation doesn't quite come in where you want it to be, well, have you thought about a contingency? Have you considered that possibility as part of your plan? Could you extend a loan with an investor? Could you, in a worst case, sell it and actually just, whatever it might be. So it's interesting to hear you say that and know that you haven't necessarily got a risk tolerance that's much higher than the average person's. You've just acknowledged that it exists and it's just sort of got to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's talk about the project then. Fantastic project. There's a video in your case study and all the juicy numbers. So the building that you bought, the property that you bought, was 180,000, and as we've already mentioned, you spent about 175,000 pounds on it. And I think, in your words, it was completely uninhabitable. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
So when you were going through this process of purchasing it and then starting to think about the refurb, when it came to things like planning permission and building regs, what sort of stuff was going on? What sort of things were you having to consider, which I imagine, again, were sort of further complicated by the fact that you were out of the country?
Yeah. Well, so I think going back to kind of what I said about removing friction, we were looking for the least friction, i.e. planning permission is something that ideally, if you don't have to, you don't really want to, get into that. However, this project gave us the opportunity to do a title split, which obviously required planning permission. However, we could kind of segregate that as two different properties. So it's across 4 floors, 198 square meters. And what we could do is focus on those first 3 floors, renovate those, start generating an income and refinance, and then focus on the basement as a kind of cherry on top to the project.
So we spent £175,000. How did that project go? And what sort of challenges did you have to overcome through that process?
Yeah, where to start? We obviously had to figure out everything from the start. I think the builder was one that we were most worried about, because that's one that if you get that wrong, then the project really could be over before it started. So I did find a project manager. I knew I obviously wouldn't be on the ground, and then wanted to test that as far as I could in terms of at what point could I push that to then not be on the ground. So project manager was key. Having a project manager that had a relationship with that main contractor was super important. Challenges were everything from how do I pick up the keys when I'm not in the market? How do I arrange access for people when I don't even have a set of keys? I still don't have a set of keys to this property. Then obviously, how do I ensure that when I'm being asked for a payment, that the work is actually completed to the right level? So throughout managing that project, step away, doing it from Amsterdam. We had challenges like the soundproofing. So even investors that we know in our network that are even further along than we are, nobody's ever been held to the kind of party building regs, and we to a letter, and we were held to that on this project. So we had to engage with a sound consultant. It added 25% cost to the refurb, obviously money that we weren't planning to spend. This was right at the time when all material costs were going through the roof, because we had to manage through Brexit. I mean, the list of kind of external factors away from Brexit. We then had the material costs, the utilities crisis. I mean, everything that almost could go wrong. Externally, you'd have friends going, "Well, told you so." Property's not the right time, and all the rest of it. But we knew that we'd done enough work on the front end that we were able to ultimately, with all of these challenges, 25% extra on the refurb, 45k down valuation on the first 3 floors for the HMO, through all of this, we were still able to ultimately get 48%, return on capital invested just for the first 3 floors, and we're expecting then with the basement will land roughly around the 93-94%. So as close to a unicorn as we've ever been on a project.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking back over the last few years, it does sound a little bit like a horror story, doesn't it? Material prices and labour issues and utility issues and all of that stuff. Down valuation, like you said, these things, these variables that are not within our control. But you still, and I mean, I know we're waiting to get the sort of the basement unit sort of finalised and valued, but you've had the upper units, the big HMO done. We're still on track for a 94% return on capital employed, which is an incredible. I mean, it's incredible for any deal. But, throw in the fact that actually this is a HMO in a prime sort of city centre location. At Huddersfield, it might not be a Newcastle or a Liverpool or a Manchester, but it's still a very established university with a lot of infrastructure there. So, throw in that, and it looks like an incredible result, and throw in then the fact that you're doing all of this from Amsterdam, and it almost doesn't sound believable, and it's a really, really, really great example of what can be done if you do it the right way. Looking back now, having this sort of experience behind you, is there anything that you would change about the way that you approached it or actually delivered the project?
Yeah, definitely. I think on every project that we do, there's always learnings. I don't think we'll ever. Well, I'd be worried if we said that we kind of learned it all. I think you always continue to learn. I think obviously this was proof of concept for us. So throughout, we've kind of had to figure out and test every element of that hands-off approach in doing things remotely. So throughout, we've kind of listed our SOP kind of library so that we ultimately know, right, okay, this is the way we'll do it again for our next project that we've got going currently. I think with the main contractor and the project manager, I think that there were a lot of learnings there of just ultimately how I remove myself kind of from the triangle, because ultimately if I'm speaking too much to the main contractor, there's an issue there because I am employing a project manager. So I think just getting super tight on the schedule of works and just literally having everything in writing. There was, as we moved quite fast, there were just a couple of elements that we didn't put in that schedule of work, which ultimately then cost us a little bit more on the back end. The party is one example of that, adding quite a large cost, but all good lessons learned. And I think what's actually kind of funny now is we look at everything that's happened with the adding 25% and interest rates and everything, and actually based on our original numbers we would have been kind of over 100% return if we'd managed to get that 45k higher valuation, and also our mortgage would have been in the kind of high 600s rather than now you're looking at a kind of 1400 a month mortgage.
And what's next then, Samuel? What sort of plan do you have in terms of scaling up this business?
So we're going through conveyancing on our next project. So we've already recycled the money on the main HMO, the 3-story. We'll be doing that with our own funds. We're looking at closing out the basement, obviously, that we've already mentioned. We're getting another project here in Amsterdam. And then we're actually looking at another project, which we've got an opportunity for investors to come on for. So we're looking at kind of fixed rate return for investors or an earn and learn. So either 10 or 8% return.
I mean, on that kind of learnings point, for anyone out there who's perhaps sort of been sitting on the sidelines, maybe in a similar circumstance to yourself, lives overseas, wants to build an asset base here in the UK, what advice would you give them, Samuel? If there were sort of 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you would share that you think have served you really well, what would those be?
So I think for us, it's really figure out that vision, and whether it's just you doing this on your own or with friends or a partner, really, really, really work out what's the end goal. I kind of use the Amazon approach of working backwards. And that's really, you need to know if you're on the right road, because you just, it is tough. There will be challenges, but if you know that where you're going, it'll be worth it. I think the second element really is that due diligence. So educate yourself. There's so much free content out there, but I would say kind of verify everything yourself. So don't just take what you see on YouTube or what you read as gospel. Really verify that for yourself. And then I think the third one for us would really be get either a network or even a mentor. We work with a mentor who is further ahead than us by a few years. And I think that really enabled us to kind of just the hundreds of mistakes that we would have made have just been removed. And that investment in somebody else who is just that bit further ahead of you ultimately just makes you go faster, reduces the costly mistakes, and will get you ultimately towards your goals faster.
I think they are three superb pieces of advice. And, when you sort of talk about it like this, Samuel, it's quite easy to see why you've done this and been able to do it so successfully. And I think there's a huge amount for our listeners to take away from today's episode. So thank you so much for sharing it all. For anyone who would like to get into contact with you, Samuel, what's the best way?
So you can find us on Instagram. So we're HemCo, HemCo _properties. And you can also find us on our website, so www.hemcoproperty.co.uk.
Fantastic. And of course, Samuel's case study, which is amazing. All of those numbers, plus all of the detail about that process of figuring out where and what to invest in, and of course all of the before and after photos. And I have to say, the after photos really are remarkable. It's a beautiful project, a great example, a fantastic HMO. They're all there waiting for our members to go and have a good old look at. Samuel, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I'm really, really looking forward to seeing what you do next, and I am sure it's going to be fantastic. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me on, Andy.